Hi, my name is Mark Hage, and welcome to this insight session on YEC11 International A-Level Economics for the June 2024 series. In this event, we'll be focusing on the areas of each paper that perform the weakest. To do this, we'll be looking at the 5 worst performing questions on each of the 2 A-Level papers. By the end of the session, you should have received feedback on the performance of candidates in this May-June 2024 exam series, considered the variation of candidates' performance on different questions, explored why performance varies, and understood the key points from the examiner's report. Hi, my name is Mark Hage. Welcome to this event, which is focused on the performance of students in the International AS Level Economics papers in summer 2024. This is what we call an insight event, where we'll be focusing on the areas of each paper that perform the weakest. To do this, we will be looking at the 5 worst performing questions on each of the 2 AS level papers. By the end of the session, you should have received feedback on the performance of candidates in the May-June 2024 exam series, considered the variation of candidates' performance on different questions, explored why performance varies, and understood the key points from the examiner's report. Firstly, let's look at the grade boundaries and the marks needed to achieve each grade for the International AS Level Economics in summer 2024. To contrast student performance, we'll compare the summer 2024 series with the summer 2019 series. 2019, if you remember, was the first sitting of this paper. As you can see from the first table, there has been no change from the 2019 grade boundary percentages to the 2024 grade boundaries. Student performance has returned to pre-pandemic levels. The first June sitting of this AS level specification, as I said, was June 2019, hence this is why we're using this for comparison. The grade boundary marks are given in UMS. This is the second table. The UMS mark, standing for Uniform Mark Scale, is a conversion of the raw marks. Raw marks are converted to UMS marks for all modular qualifications. This is because raw mark grade boundaries may change from exam session to exam session to take into account variations in the difficulty of assessments. UMS marks therefore allow for an easier comparison of marks between exam sittings where students can take module units at different times of year, i.e. 2019 UMS is a better comparison of how students performed than looking at the raw marks for each of these sittings. As you can see from the UMS marks in this table, the marks required to achieve each grade hasn't changed from 2019 to the current 2024 exam series. If we now look at the grade boundaries for each unit, Unit 1 and 2, we can see in terms of UMS percentages, again, the comparison between 2019 and 2024 June sessions shows that the individual units are performing in exactly the same way in terms of grade boundaries. On this particular slide, we're going to actually look at the raw mark comparison for AS level economics. If we look at a comparison of raw marks between 2019 and the 2024 session, there has been a slight increase in grade boundaries for all grades for Unit 1. For example, an A required 57 marks in 2019 compared to 59 marks in 2024. For Unit 2, the opposite has occurred. There has been a slight decrease in raw mark grade boundaries between 2019 and summer 2024. For example, an A in 2019 needed 56 raw marks compared to 55 raw marks in 2024. As you can see, the differences are slight. Remember to treat these figures with caution, as UMS provides a better comparison of the 2 years of performance. However, it might help for you to look at your own centre's performance at each unit to see if one unit's performance is markedly better than the other. This may steer you into where to spend time in terms of trying to gain the most improvements for students. Now let's move on to looking at the 2 AS level units and the 5 worst performing questions for each. For both Unit 1 and 2, a number of themes have occurred. That is that the highest scoring questions all feature in the worst performing questions of that paper, i.e. those of 12 and 20 marks. It will therefore be worth reviewing candidate performance in your centre to look at any basic issues on these questions. For example, are a large proportion actually finishing each paper? If not, timing and the level of detail written on lower scoring responses may need to be looked at to see if there's something that needs to be addressed. For either unit, I have not included in the top 5 worst performing questions the multiple choice, though it may be worth you having a look at these in terms of how your centre and students performed. Let's start now by looking at the top 5 worst performing questions on Unit 1. For each question we will look at, I will provide you with similar information. The questions are also in chronological order rather than in any order of which one is the worst performer. However, I will let you know various details about each question as we go through them. If we look at this question, question 8, we can see I've firstly provided you with the question itself. On the left-hand side, below that, I've given you an extract from the mark scheme. And on the right-hand side, there is an extract from a sample response taken from the Principal Examiner's report. Both of these documents are on the Pearson website. For all mark scheme extracts and sample responses, they are simply there to give you a flavour of the type of areas credited for each question and examples of exam technique that gained good scores. Finally, I have provided a breakdown of the marks for each question and the percentages of students achieving each mark. Question 8 is a points-based question and worth 4 marks. This means the marks are awarded where the skill being tested is shown in the candidate's response. The question is, with reference to hotel breakfasts, explain why the above information illustrates diminishing marginal utility. If you look at the mark scheme on the left-hand side, you can see there are marks for AO1, which if you remember is knowledge and understanding, AO2, which is the application of knowledge and understanding to the question, and AO3, which is analysis. For question 8, there is 1 AO1 mark, 1 AO2 mark, and 2 marks for AO3. The question required students to explain why the case study and associated data illustrates diminishing marginal utility, specifically using context for answers. If we look at the table showing each mark and the percentage of students achieving each mark, we can see that 14.2% scored 0. This is the worst performing question on Unit 1 Summer 2024 for students scoring 0 on any question. This indicates that a significant number of students had no knowledge or understanding of diminishing marginal utility. Also note that 64% of responses gained half marks or below, again indicating an inability to develop analysis or context to answer the question. Only just over 10% of scores were 3 or 4 marks. Diminishing marginal utility was often not well understood in responses. Whilst most could access the application mark, many confused diminishing marginal utility with decreasing marginal utility and struggle to access any knowledge or analysis mark. The concept of diminishing marginal utility therefore appears to need more work, and getting candidates to consider diminishing utility related to all-you-can-eat buffets and breakfasts would be a sensible approach. This question proved challenging for many, as there was a significant number with a misconception about what diminishing marginal utility was. Many identified it as where total utility fell, but it is where marginal utility falls. The utility is rising, but at a slower rate. On the right-hand side of the slide, I've given you a sample response from the examiner's report. Notice how succinct the answer is. This accesses full marks as they do understand the concept. The marks, if we look at the sample response, were awarded as follows. The first mark is awarded as the learner is clear that it is the extra utility received in consuming an extra unit that decreases. The second mark is awarded for the reference to the STEM in terms of 80% visit 3 times. The third mark is to them becoming full. And the final mark is for explaining why they do not return for the 4th bowl. Remember, diminishing marginal utility is where utility rises, but at a slower rate. To gain higher marks on the question, candidates firstly need to be clear as to what diminishing marginal utility is, and not to confuse this with decreasing marginal utility. They then need to ensure study is used when discussing the concept. Remember, context must be used to answer the question, not simply inserted into the question, a key point to underline with students. The points then need to be developed through 2 to 3 cause and effect statements to show the correct level of analysis. If you look at the extract, student response, there is very good evidence of a well-developed chain of reasoning using the case study as well as the interpretation of data. The next question we will look at is question 9. This again is a points-based question, as discussed in question 8. The question asks, with reference to lighthouses, explain the difference between non-rivalry and non-excludability, and is worth 4 marks. The marks are broken down into 1 mark for AO1, 1 for AO2, and this time 2 for AO3, that's analysis. If we look at the table, we can see that 11.6% of students scored 0, the second most zeros in the paper. Over 45% have scored half marks or less. There were more responses, though, that gained 3 or 4 marks. That's 23.9% for 3 and 27.1% for 4. The question focused on public goods, and by looking at their understanding of the 2 concepts that make up a public good, made the question more challenging for learners. The ability to explain non-excludability was more limited, as many just said it was not excludable. This just rearranged the words, and more was needed, therefore achieving few marks. Non-rivalry was better understood. Whilst 1 mark was for the information listed from the STEM, the second mark needed an explanation relevant to ships' use of lighthouses. Many struggled to access this final mark. This question tested learners' understanding of non-excludability and non-rivalry. It showed that whilst most could identify that this makes good public goods, some struggled to explain the difference between the 2 concepts. Many just said non-excludability is where the product is not excludable. This is just repeating the key word. It's important to use different words to represent the idea of people not being prevented or stopped from accessing a good. If we look at the sample response taken from the principal examiner's report, we can see the first mark is awarded for understanding that non-rivalry means the consumption of one person does not affect the consumption of another. The second mark is for understanding that non-excludability is where people cannot be prevented from consuming. The third mark is for reference to the STEM and the number of lighthouses globally. The final mark is for illustrating with the example why ships cannot be excluded or there is not rivalry between ships. In order to improve performance on this type of question, candidates need to be reminded of the difference between non-rivalry and non-excludability. Context should be drawn from the case study and used to specifically answer the question. Finally, each analysis point should be developed by two strands combined with relevant use of the case study. The next question we're going to look at on Unit 1 is question 12e. The question asked, with reference to Extract C, discuss the benefits of subsidies paid to rice growers. The students then had to illustrate their answer with an appropriate diagram. This question was worth 14 marks. This question is the first levels of response-based question and requires candidates to include chains of reasoning in both their analysis and evaluation. Levels of response questions are marked holistically by the examiner. This means the whole response is read, bearing in mind the three levels of response descriptors. These descriptors cover knowledge and understanding, which is AO1, application of knowledge and understanding, which is AO2, analysis, which is AO3, and evaluation, AO4. The examiner then decides which description of the skills is the best fit for the response, i.e. is it level 1, 2, or 3. Looking at the evidence in the table, this was the worst performing levels of response question on the paper, with 4% of candidates getting no marks at all. Just over 26% of responses failed to gain half marks, and just over 23% gained 11 to 14 marks. Diagrams were not included, or weak responses failed to grasp what subsidies meant. Diagrams were often not well labelled or clear. There also need to be more reference and analysis of the diagram used, with clear links to subsidies paid to rice growers. Remember, context must help answer the question in order to gain any marks. Analysis was often superficial and not well developed, and candidates often provided short statements with little development of chains of reasoning. For the AO3 and AO4 marks, points should be developed using a cause and effect approach, integrating relevant data and/or the case study. This then forms a multi-stage chain of reasoning for level 3 marks. In weaker responses, reasons were poorly explained and generic, resulting in low level marks. If we look at the extract from the student response, which you can find in the principal examiner's report, we can see that the first paragraph defines subsidy and gives data on the size of subsidy from the data. This starts in level 1. The diagram is accurate and is supported with analysis that explicitly shows areas from the diagram. Subsidies impact on quantity, price, producer surplus, consumer surplus and government spending. The incidence of the subsidy is wrong, but credit's offered to what is accurately shown. On the second page of the response, not shown here, they apply well to how the subsidies will be used and how this will improve output and create innovation, helping with productivity. The response does start to build a macro focus, but there is enough microeconomics toward top of level 3 for knowledge, application and analysis. The evaluation of the response starts on the third page. It starts by looking at possible government failure, particularly the section focused on the setting of the correct level of subsidy. It also considers the potential for overfarming and unintended consequences. Opportunity costs are also considered. Enough offered for evaluation here to achieve the top of level 3. In order to get better student response on this style of question, firstly, students should identify the key areas in the 40-mark question that they're being asked to consider. They then need to discuss in each turn to aid a logical structure to the answer. Remember, quality is more important than quantity in order for responses to display the skills necessary to reach the level 3 descriptors. It's better to do 2 benefits of subsidies really well than 4 poorly. This means the examiner has to consider the full range of levels. Also, candidates need to develop points of analysis and evaluation. This should be a 3 cause and effects sentences or points with context in order to reach level 3. Finally, evaluation needs to critique the responses analysis and offer a judgment based on answering the question. This then moves us on to section D, where the candidates need to choose one of the 2 essay-style questions. They are all marked as levels of response questions in the manner previously discussed. Question 13 here requires students to evaluate the possible factors that would cause a rightward shift of a country's production possibility frontier. They then had to provide at least one relevant diagram in their answer. The question's worth 20 marks. Evidence shows that the average score on this question was 19%, with over students scoring less than half marks. This was the worst performing question on the paper. Most responses gained a score of between 6 and 10 marks. Only just over 2% of responses gained higher than 14 marks, and unfortunately, no student managed to score 19 or 20 marks. Diagrams with this question were either absent or very poorly drawn on student responses. Evidence was also not always used to develop points. Responses that included appropriately labelled diagrams were sometimes not referred to in answers, and the data interpreted in the context of the question. Analysis was also superficial in many cases and not well developed, and candidates often provided short statements with little development of chains of reasoning. For AO3 and 4 marks, points should be developed using a cause and effect approach, integrating relevant data or other types of evidence. This then forms a multi-stage chains of reasoning for the level 4 marks. In weaker responses, reasons were poorly explained and generic, resulting in low level marks. There was poor reference to answers that went beyond the space provided. Rather than using the white space at the end of a page, it's a good idea to continue a response on a continuation sheet or a new answer booklet. Please make sure that students understand this and that it's clear what the process is. This ensures that the examiner knows they have not seen the full response. If we look at the extract from the student response found in the principal examiner's report, we can see the response starts with an accurate definition of a production possibility frontier. The diagram is then drawn accurately. They then go on to explore factors that may cause the rightward shift. They start by exploring the increase in population using the data from the stem of the essay. This is linked to the size of the workforce, including looking at immigration of skilled workers who will improve efficiency. This is evaluated by looking at whether they are able to work. If elderly or unskilled, they argue they will have little impact on growth. The response then moves on to technology, linking advancements to the increased innovation from a larger population. This is evaluated linked to the state of the economy and the quality of education. The final page, not shown here, looks at finding new resources, i.e. focusing on oil. A conclusion is offered which summarises earlier arguments. The knowledge application analysis is in level 4 and the evaluation is in level 3 due to its summary approach. To achieve a high level for knowledge and application analysis, students need to include an appropriate diagram. Many did not provide one, which limited the score they could achieve. For evaluation, students needed to give reasons why these differentials may not exist. and some were able to explore the significance of the reasons they had provided. For some was very limited on this question, and very few candidates were able to reach level 2 or above. Most candidates listed reasons without development, and very few candidates provided any context. In order to get better students' responses, firstly, students should identify the key areas of the question which is being asked for. Particularly with the question, in this case, a detailed diagram that is clear, accurate, and appropriately labelled needs to be included, or else marks are likely to be on the lower side. Students need to discuss each factor chosen in turn to provide a logical structure to their answer. Again, quality is more important than quantity, so it's best to focus on 2 well-developed chains of reasoning rather than a scattergun approach. If students do this, this means the examiner has to consider the full range of levels. Then students should develop points of analysis and evaluation by a chain of 3 cause and effect sentences, integrating appropriate context and data in order to score level 4. Evaluation should adopt a very similar approach, but this time include offering a judgment and a conclusion based on the question. The final question in the 5 worst performing questions on Unit 1 is question 14. Question 14 requires students to evaluate the likely impact of imposing indirect taxes on aeroplane flights to reduce carbon emissions. Again, it required the students to include at least 1 relevant diagram. This question was far more popular than question 13 and therefore tended to be of the higher quality. Looking at the table, we can see that the average mark was 39%, with over 50% of students achieving over half marks. However, higher marks were thin on the ground, with just over 10% of responses scoring 14 or more. Most students could accurately define indirect taxes, with some exploring ad valorem and specific taxes in their answer. Most could accurately draw the diagram, but better responses used the information from within the diagram in their written analysis. Weaker responses focused on the impact of quantity and price, whilst better responses went on to explore consumer surplus, producer surplus, tax revenue, incidence of tax, and external costs. It was pleasing to see that so many responses focused on the airline industry in their answers, and it was rare to see generic responses about indirect taxation. If we look at the extract from the student response found in the principal examiner's report, we can see that the first paragraph defines indirect taxation accurately and then uses the data on the change in carbon emissions. This is then linked to the global warming and flooding. The diagram is drawn accurately, and the second paragraph uses the diagram to consider the impact on price and quantity. The third paragraph goes on to consider the impact of the consumers, looking at consumer incidence and consumer surplus. The evaluation looks at the inelasticity of demand and the limited impact on the quantity consumed. Tax evasion and information failure are also considered. Once again, the response is in level 4 for knowledge, application analysis, and level 3 for evaluation. To achieve a higher level of knowledge, application analysis, students needed to include an appropriate diagram, which some didn't provide. For evaluation, students needed to give which impact is the most likely to reduce and explore the significance of the reasons that they had provided. The evaluation was sometimes limited on this question, and few candidates were able to reach level 2 or above. Most candidates listed reasons without development, and very few candidates provided any context on the evaluation. As is the common theme with question 12E, 13 and 14, a good strategy for responses to focus on is fewer points with much more detailed development. Also, evidence needs to be integrated into analytical and evaluative points. Students should try to explain the links between cause and consequence to provide more analysis to achieve higher levels. Remember, it's about developing chains of reasoning, and this is done by cause and effect statements of at least 2 to 3 chains in length. That concludes our look at the 5 worst performing questions on Unit 1. Now let's look at how Unit 2. Now we've looked at Unit 1, let's move on to Unit 2 and look at the top 5 worst performing questions. Let's start with question 12A, which is a points-based question worth 2 marks. This means marks are awarded where the skill being tested is shown in the candidate's response. If you look at the mark scheme on the left-hand side, you can see that there are only 2 marks for knowledge and understanding. Candidates in this question need to define the term corporation tax and then offer an expansion of their definition. If we look at the mark grid, we can see that 18.4% of students scored 0 on this question, showing some students had no knowledge and understanding of corporation tax. The average score was 35%, only just over a third of responses scoring 2 marks. 66.8% of students scored half marks, that's 1 or less. This was the worst performing question statistically on this paper. It's important to explain the key definitions here clearly and accurately. Remember, there are no application marks, so they will not be awarded for making any reference to the extract. It's also important for students to remember the difference between a firm's income, revenue and profits. If we look at the sample response, we can see the candidate defines the term and then offers relevant expansion for the 2 marks. In order to improve responses, candidates need to be regularly tested on key terms such as this and be clear about concepts such as income, revenue and profit. The next of our worst performing questions was a 4-mark question. That's question 12B. This question is also a points-based question worth 4 marks. This means the marks are awarded where the skill being tested is shown in the candidate's response. If you look at the mark scheme on the left-hand side, you can see there are marks for AO1, which is knowledge and understanding, and AO2, which is the application of knowledge and understanding to the question. Note there are no marks here for AO3, that's analysis. For question 12B, there are 2 AO1 marks and 2 AO2 marks. Question 12B asked students to explain what was meant by gross national income. The question asked students to use extract A to tell us what was meant by gross national income. If we look at the table, we can see that 11.5% of students scored 0, the third most zeros in the paper. For over 34% of responses, they scored half marks or less. There was a good proportion of students who gained 3 or more marks, however. That's 18.7% for 3 marks and 10.7% for 4 marks. Many candidates in this question were able to successfully explain the term gross national income. Most were not able to mention this correctly though, and hence unable to get their 2 knowledge marks. To access the application marks, candidates to include 2 separate pieces of data from extract A. Given the nature of the question, it's also important to cover all aspects of the answer in terms of knowledge and application. The application to the answer can be found from the sources provided, and students need to be aware that this is how to approach the question. In order to get both application marks, students therefore need to use the extract. If we look at the student response from the principal examiner's report, we can see that the response gets 2 knowledge marks and 2 application marks. Therefore, this answer attains an overall score of 4 marks in total. This could be used as a very good benchmark for students to explain how this style of question works. A good strategy to help students develop their context skill on this question would be firstly to get them write down the top 2 pieces of evidence they can use from the extract to back up their knowledge points. Once they've done this, then they can specifically write the answer using the evidence they've decided is the best. This will ensure students gain the 2A02 marks and write the most relevant application required to support their knowledge. Let's now move on to section C and D questions and consider their overall weaknesses. All 3 questions had context issues. They also lacked chains of reasoning, and many responses made shorter points. Remember, for longer students are supposed to have a high level of awareness of countries to form the basis of their arguments to achieve the highest levels. This is either obtained from the extracts or from their own research. There was also evidence of timing issues, regardless of which questions students attempted, and we're particularly talking about the last 2 questions, question 13 and 14. This question is the first of the levels-based questions, question 12E. Levels-based marking questions require candidates to include chains of reasoning in both their analysis and evaluation. Levels of response questions, remember, are marked holistically by the examiner. This means the whole response is read through by the examiner, and whilst they do this, they bear in mind the levels of response descriptors. These descriptors cover knowledge and understanding, that's AO1, application of knowledge and understanding, that's AO2, analysis, that's AO3, and finally evaluation, which is AO4. The examiner then decides which description of the skills is the best fit for the response, i.e. is it level 1, 2, or the highest, level 3. Question 12E asks candidates to use the source to discuss the limitations of using gross domestic product to compare living standards between countries. The question was worth 14 marks. The evidence in the table shows that this was the 3rd worst performing question on this unit, with the average score being 45%. That's less than half marks. 52.3% of students scored less than half marks. If you look at the data, you can also see students scored 0, and just over 17% of students scored between 10 and 14 marks. It's important that candidates refer to limitations and develop analysis by focusing on those points rather than trying to cover as many facts as possible. This way, the candidates will be able to access the higher levels of response. A handful of candidates answering this question were able to successfully explain income inequality and informal economy as limitations. They were able to integrate this within their question using the correct level of application. Although not required, some students supported their analysis with an accurately drawn and labelled diagram. This gave them access to level 3. However, several candidates copied text from the source and did not explain their points. This gave them access to only level 1. Evaluation points on some student responses were fairly sound. They included the benefits of GDP, gross domestic product. Many included time lags as an evaluator comment, but were not able to successfully support this point using a logical chain of reasoning. Candidates should ensure that they do this as opposed to listing a number of separate, undeveloped points. Centres should ensure the focus is on developing only 2 points by adding multi-stage chains of reasoning. Evaluation of these 2 analysis points also carry depth to access the higher levels. A conclusion, remember, for this question is not required. If we have a look at the extract from the sample response, which you can find in the Principal Examiner's report, this is shown on the right-hand side of the slide, this answer actually got out of 14 marks. Both analysis points on limitations were able to score level 3, giving a score of 8 out of 8. However, the evaluation was weak and therefore only was able to gain a score of 4 out of 6. In order to gain student improvement on this style of question, they should not write in bullet points but in paragraphs, with each containing a separate point. For example, a limitation of GDP to compare standards of living between countries. Responses should develop 2 points with 3 chains of reasoning, and the use of specific concepts should be integrated into that chain of reasoning for the countries in the analysis. Evaluation should also be developed using the same chains of reasoning. This way, the student can gain high-level access for analysis and evaluation. Now let's move on to the last 2 questions, the last 2 underperforming questions on Unit 2, which are both from Section D. That's question 13 and 14. Question 13 was the better performing question of these 2 options. Question 13 asked students to evaluate supply-side policies that a government could use to increase the rate of economic growth and to decrease the rate of inflation. In addition, to access the high level for knowledge, analysis and application, candidates were required to include application in the answer by referring to a country of their choice. If we look at the marks and percentage of students achieving each mark, the evidence shows that the average score on this question was 49%. It also shows that 44% of responses scored less than half marks. Just over 16% of students scored 15 or more marks. Most candidates were able to analyse the policies, especially government spending on education and infrastructure. There were many who were unable to explain, however, their points identified in depth by adding multi-stage chains of reasoning. Most of the answers only carried a 2-stage chain of reasoning, and hence they were not able to access level 3 for knowledge, application and analysis. Those who identified ranges of policies without any linked development were only able to access level 1. Candidates who mentioned causes of low economic growth did not attain many marks at all. Evaluation should include an attempt to discuss the short run versus the long run impact and the magnitude of the change in economic growth. These were underdeveloped and did not contain many stages of arguments. Those who listed evaluation points achieved at most level 1. That said, most candidates evaluated using benefits of economic growth and therefore were able to attain some higher level marks. If we look at the extract from the sample response shown in the principal examiner's report, we can see that it could be used as a template for candidates to write a developed chain of reasoning. Students could be given another supply-side policy after you go through this and point out the key benefits of using this multi-staged approach to analysis, and then they could use this as a template to write their own paragraph showing a developed chain of reasoning using the relevant context and the country of their choice. Note that where the examiner has more than 2 points to consider, they will credit the best 2. Therefore, candidates should only discuss 2 points and focus on creating chains of reasoning that are logical and have 3 or more developments. The points should have relevant examples from their chosen country, and this should be integrated into their response in order to achieve the higher levels. For evaluation, again, a focus on doing less points rather than many points should help students to develop their chains of reasoning skills rather than adopting a scattergun approach. This time, the response should specifically answer the question with evaluation as to which supply-side policy is the best to increase growth and decrease inflation. It should then go on to give a multi-stage chain of reasoning to actually give evidence as to why this is the case, and again use evidence from the country of the student's choice. Now we've looked at the individual paper's performance, what now follows is a summary of the key areas centres should focus on in order to make improvements based on the principal examiner's report for each unit. Once we've done this, we'll look at the resources and support available from Pearson to help you in enhancing student performance. So let's start with Unit 1, Markets in Action. For question 7, when asked to draw a diagram, all marks can be achieved through the diagram with no written explanation required. A number of candidates supported their response with written explanation when in fact the diagram itself achieved full marks. For question 8, diminishing marginal utility was not well understood, and the confusion with decreasing marginal utility needs exploring depending on how well your candidates did with this question. For question 9, candidates need to be able to define the concepts of non-rivalry and non-excludability. With the latter, it's important not just to use the word excludable in the definition. Candidates also need to define the key terms relevant to the question, and diagrams should be integrated into the analysis. Continuing with Unit 1, candidates are also encouraged to have a clear structure to their answers. They must avoid writing essays in bullet points or in long blocks, paragraphs, without making a distinction between their analysis and their evaluation points. The nature of the essay questions means that they draw on a student's knowledge accumulated throughout their course and on their ability to apply that knowledge to the question. Finally, let's encourage candidates to make full use of the specimen papers, previous examination papers, mark schemes and principal examiner's reports. Paying greater emphasis on time management is also vital for the completion of the paper. For Unit 2, Macroeconomic Performance Policy, the principal examiner suggests that we ensure that all candidates are familiar with all the quantitative skills in the paper. You can find these on page 69 of the specification. Candidates must also read questions carefully and make sure that they have addressed all parts of a question in their response. In a few different questions on the paper, not understanding requirements of the questions in terms of depth and breadth was one of the main reasons for low scores. Candidates should also be encouraged to draw accurate, appropriate, legible, and labeled diagrams to support their arguments, even if it's not required. This again would help add depth to arguments. For section B, for diagram-based questions, all marks can be achieved through a diagram and no written explanations required. This allows for a more efficient use of time. For calculation-based questions, all marks can be achieved through working out the right answer. And for questions where a text response is required, candidates should focus on identifying one point and developing it. Giving a list of points will only get knowledge marks. Continuing with feedback on Unit 2, the Principal Examiner suggests for Section C to ensure that candidates refer to the relevant extracts but not to copy from them. Brief quotations are acceptable, but in themselves, remember, will not achieve higher level marks. Remember that 4 and 6 mark questions do not require evaluation, so please get students to use the time effectively and avoid assessing the analysis points made. For Section C, 14 mark questions and Section D essays, it's a good idea to encourage candidates to develop a chain of reasoning by analysing at least 2 salient points in depth. By contrasting, covering a lot of points in a superficial way will limit the mark to a low level 2 at best. In addition, analysis needs to be contextualised by using relevant source information in Section C and appropriate examples for Section C and D, or context at the start of Section D questions. In addition, it's a good idea to ensure that candidates are aware that evaluative comments should be the context of the question being asked. These should have a chain of reasoning or sufficient development to be able to achieve at least level 2. To achieve level 3 for evaluation in Section D, it's necessary to include an informed judgment. So that brings us to the end of the points made by each principal examiner in order to help you improve your students' performance on their papers. So now you should have received feedback on the performance of candidates in the May-June 2024 exam series, considered the variation of candidate performance on different questions, explored why performance varies, and understood the key points from the examiner's report. What now follows is a short guide to the support provided by Pearson to help you improve performance in your centre. Now we've completed looking at all the exam series for 2024, let's have a brief look at the resources that Pearson's made available to help support you in the forthcoming year. This slide shows the resources and course materials available for this particular syllabus. As you can see, there are many different exemplar materials available, and what I've done in the slide is provide a link to those materials for your future reference. There are also comprehensive lists of all past exam papers since the specification started. I've given you an example on this slide. I have also given you a link which you just need to click on the slide and it'll take you to the appropriate page on the Pearson website. Pearson also provides a set of very detailed analytical tools you can use by accessing their website. The next couple of slides goes through those tools. Firstly, we have what's called the Pearson portal, and I provided a link to the website where you can access this. As you can see from the screenshot, there are various different things that you can access. I've highlighted 2 of them. One is called the Exam Wizard. This is where you can actually create from past papers your own bespoke papers to use with students in terms of examinations and testing. The second is something called Results Plus. What this does is it actually gives you access to statistics and details about your students' performance. So there's two analytical tools there which you really should be accessing in order to help enhance student performance. There's just a little bit more detail here I've given you just to show you what Results Plus is. As you can see, it shows you a number of different things you can use in order to actually look at your students' examination results. The first one's highlighted, as you can see, and under that it says Analysis Reports on your Edexcel examinations. So this is something I would highly recommend you having a look at and utilising in order to tease out the key areas and questions that your students on the summer 2024 series did best at and or worst at. This way you can focus your actual teaching on the things that need the most improvement. On this particular page, you can see Results Plus. We've clicked on Analysis Options, and as you can see, you can actually look at your student results in various different ways, and also you can download those once you've had a look at them. The one that's highlighted here, for example, is Cohort Results. Finally, I've given you a link to resources and news. And again, this can be really useful in terms of things that are currently happening in the subject. If you click on that link, it will take you to the page where you can see things like Professional Development Academy, latest news announcements, and obviously training that's available for the subject. I'd explore this, and hopefully this will provide you with further support in terms of courses and any other issues that are concerning you about the subject. That brings us to the end of this insight session. I hope you've enjoyed it. Hopefully it's helped you in terms of focusing your students for the current academic year. You have now received feedback on the performance of candidates in the May-June 2024 exam series, considered the variations of candidates' performance on the top 5 underperforming questions on each paper, explored why this performance varies, and finally understood the key points and recommendations from the examiner's reports.